This is Unit 6A. It's on respiratory physiology. Well, the respiratory system is geared towards carrying out gas exchange, and uh, and that's because the cells throughout your body require a constant supply of oxygen and are constantly producing carbon dioxide, which needs to be removed. Um, so there's gas exchange, and that occurs between um, from the cells to interstitial fluid to the uh, bloodstream plasma, the blood plasma into the red cells for CO2, and for oxygen from the red cells into the plasma, into the interstitial fluid, and then into cells. And this is all carried out by diffusion across membranes. So the gases are diffusing out and they're following their concentration gradient. They're going from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. The idea is to supply oxygen for the purposes of aerobic respiration, so that uh, the cells in the body can generate ATP using aerobic respiration, which is the most efficient mechanism of generating energy, and to dispose of CO2, which is generated during the oxidation of carbohydrates, particularly glucose. Respiration involves four distinct major processes, and these are pulmonary ventilation. Ventilation is a term referred to for moving air in and out of the lungs. External respiration, which is the gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Transporting of gas between the lungs and the tissues and then back to the lungs. So transport of oxygen from the lungs to the heart to the tissues, and then transport of CO2 from the tissues to the heart to the lungs. Now that's gas delivery and gas uptake for oxygen and CO2 respectively. And then there's internal respiration, which is the gas exchange between the systemic blood vessels and the tissues. So you have two major types of respiration going on: external respiration, gas exchange between the lungs and the blood, and internal, between the blood and the tissues. And we're going to go through each of these a little bit once we go through the anatomy of the respiratory system. Essentially, the respiratory system consists of two major zones. One is the conducting zone, in which there's no gas exchange. It's simply delivery, transporting of gas, conducting the air through the tubular system. So it provides the conduit ducts for air movement, and it includes all of the structures: the nose, nasal cavity, the pharynx, trachea, etc., all the way down to the bronchi and the smallest bronchioles. This one thing that is happening through that conducting zone is that the air gets cleansed of any particles, solid dust particles, or anything else solid, and it gets fully humidified and it gets warmed up. The other zone is the respiratory zone, and that's the zone where you have actual gas exchange, and that's actually consists of the respiratory bronchioles, and I'll talk in a little bit what I mean by respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts and the alveoli, where the exchange is actually occurring. You have respiratory muscles. They include the diaphragm and any other muscle that can promote ventilation. And I must say, ventilation of the lungs at rest is much simpler than ventilation with exercise. There's two sets of muscles that are involved in respiration at rest versus several different ones, many more that are involved in forced ventilation or ventilation of the lungs, external respiration when you're exercising. In terms of conducting zone, you have the nose, which provides an airway and moistens and warms the air entering and filters it. It also acts as a resonating chamber for speech. You know, if your nose is blocked, that'll make your voice sound quite different. And it also has sensory nerve receptors that are specific for smell. And these are the olfactory sensory nerve receptors that are present in the nasal epithelium in the nasal cavity. In terms of the structure of the nose, you have the external nose. That's what you see on people's faces. And then there's the internal nasal cavity, which is behind that and is actually quite a large space. Here you see that air enters through the nostrils. The nostrils are also called the external nares. You have the external nares, which you see as the two holes at the tip of the nose, but then you also have internal nares further higher up. The nose is divided by a midline septum, nasal septum, and behind that you have the nasal cavity. There are also hairs in the nose that can filter coarse particles, can trap them before they get further into your respiratory tract. The nose itself is made up of cartilage. There's no bone in it except at the base. The rest is cartilage, and the type of cartilage is actually called hyaline cartilage. When we look at a cross section, this is a midline section through the middle of the person. So it's we're looking now at this person's left side, the far left side of their nasal cavity in this diagram. You have exposure in this diagram of the internal nasal cavity, which is all of this area here. Okay. The roof is formed with bones, which separate it from the cavity containing the skull. And the floor is made up of the hard and soft palates. The first part is going from the front towards the back, from anterior to posterior. There's a hard palate, and then further back there's a soft palate. Let's just see if that's marked. Yeah, hard palate for the floor of the nasal cavity, which is the roof of your mouth, of your oral cavity. The first part is the hard palate, and the second part is the soft palate, where there's no bone. The nasal cavity is lined by a mucosa. That means, like every part of your body that's in contact with the external world, every part of your body that's in contact with the external world is covered with a epithelial layer, a layer of epithelial tissue. Most of the outside of you is covered with a what's called a stratified squamous epithelium. Inner surfaces like this, your respiratory tract, your GI tract, genitourinary tract, are all lined for the most part, not 100%, but mostly lined with mucosal epithelium. And most of that is not multiple layers, but a single layer. And it contains mucus secreting cells, which is where the term mucosa comes from. It can be called a mucosa or mucosal epithelium. The nasal cavity is lined by two types of mucosal epithelium. There's the olfactory mucosa that has the olfactory sensory nerve receptor endings. And then there's the respiratory mucosa, which is made of the type of epithelium is called a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Now that might be a mouthful, but it has particular meaning. There are, as I said, cells in that secrete mucus. That's why it's called a mucosa. They are called goblet cells. They actually secrete a protein called mucin, M-U-C-I-N, which turns into mucus when it contacts water. So it gets secreted out, it's produced first as mucin, and then when it contacts water, as it's coming out, it turns into mucus. The mucus contains antibacterial proteins, including lysozyme and defensins. And in this way, any bacteria that enters in is actually, for the most part, quickly destroyed by these molecules, which have the ability to attach and lyse bacteria. Well, the nasal cavity, besides being the place where you detect molecules that your brain interprets as smell, is a place where you have humidification and warming of the air coming in. There's a high degree of mucus secretion and high humidity in the nasal cavity, so that helps humidify the air. And there are many plexuses of capillaries just underneath the nasal mucosal surface. A plexus is a network, so you have many networks of capillaries underneath there, and they help warm up the air also. You have cells that are ciliated, and they help, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium that I talked about, have these cilia, these projections that help remove contaminated mucus. They beat constantly. I'll talk about that in a little bit. It's a fairly sensitive mucosa. It'll trigger sneezing if stimulated by a lot of particles, solid particles in the air that you're breathing in will trigger a sneeze, which is a reflex to help clear it. You also have these flaps or structures. I'm going to just highlight them here on the wall. This is the far wall, the left side wall of the nasal mucosa. There's another one that's been cut away because this is a midline section right through the middle of the person's skull in this diagram. So you have these flaps hanging down on the side walls on both sides of the nasal cavity, and this is these are called concha. So you have a superior, middle, and inferior concha, and they what they do is they help to increase the overall mucosal surface area. So there's more surface area for the air to contact with to get humidified and warmed up, and they actually help make the air more turbulent, so there's more interaction between the air and the nasal mucosa. When we look at that during inhalation, it's a two-way thing, and they actually act as a heat exchanger. They're filtering dust, heating up and moistening the air, but during exhalation or expiration, they reclaim some heat and moisture. Further back is the pharynx, and the pharynx is divided into three regions: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. And you have essentially that's funnel-shaped structures that go from the nasal cavity down through the back of the oral cavity down to the larynx and the esophagus, where where the two split, where the trachea and the esophagus split. And it's shown here, and I've underlined them. The nasopharynx is this upper area here, and the oropharynx is further down, and the laryngopharynx is just the last area before you get to the epiglottis, which is a flap that closes when you're swallowing anything. Anytime you swallow food, water, saliva, anything you swallow, part of that action involves lowering of the epiglottis so that it closes off the trachea so that no solid or liquid can get into the trachea, into your respiratory tract. It has to go down the esophagus. So the nasopharynx is strictly an air passageway for air coming from the nasal cavity or going towards the nasal cavity. It's lined with that pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It'll close when you swallow. It also closes off when you swallow so that food or liquid doesn't go up into your nasal cavity. It also has openings, tubes that connect the nasopharynx to the middle ear. So and these tubes are the reason why you can equalize air pressure when you go higher up or come down. There's a difference in pressure between your middle ear and the outer ear, these auditory tubes provide a way of equalizing the pressure. When you yawn, for example, when you're going up or coming down in an airplane and you yawn, you tend to stretch them out and open them up so that the pressure can equalize on either side of the eardrum, separating the outer from the middle ear. Below the nasopharynx, you have the oropharynx. It's lined with a stratified squamous epithelium, a multi-layered flat cell epithelium, because it experiences a lot of abrasion due to the food that you're swallowing. So it needs to have multiple layers that can slough off at the top so that abrasion doesn't injure the tissues underneath. Further down you have the laryngopharynx, and that's the place where you have the epiglottis that separates food down into the digestive tract and air in the respiratory tract. If you're breathing, not swallowing any liquid or food, then it's open, and the esophagus actually has soft walls that collapse, so all the air goes into your trachea. As soon as you swallow, reflex action closes the epiglottis so that the drink, liquid, or food goes down your trachea, down your esophagus. The laryngopharynx is surrounded by the larynx, which is mostly cartilage and helps to provide open airway, and the epiglottis is part of that larynx, and so it contains the switching mechanism to correctly route air and food down the trachea versus the esophagus, and it's also important in production of sound. This is a diagram showing the larynx. All the blue material is cartilage. You'll notice that right at the bottom there you have around the beginning of the trachea you have these rings, cartilaginous rings, that helps stiffen, and that'll go all the way down the trachea and the first bronchi, and that stiffens the walls so they don't collapse, so that you always have an open airway in that section. So this is a diagram looking down the throat, looking at towards the larynx, and you can see that there are vocal ligaments stretched through the airway, and they're involved in sound production. Sound is produced by air rushing past these elastic fibers, and you can control in part your speech that way, and certainly loudness, and the pharynx overall helps to resonate, amplify, and enhance sound quality. The sound itself is shaped by, in part, the pharynx, but also the tongue, soft palate and lips are obviously involved in generating different sound types. Okay, so here we are at the trachea, and it's a flexible, mobile structure extending down from the larynx down, from the epiglottis downwards. It has cartilage in its wall, C rings. They're called C rings. So they're cartilaginous rings of hyaline cartilage that help stiffen the wall and make it not prevent it from collapsing. And so it remains open. There are 3 layers, going from the innermost layer, which is the mucosa or mucosal epithelium, which is a ciliated epithelium. It is in fact a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Just below that you have the submucosal layer, which is connective tissue deeper in below the surface, containing blood vessels and nerves, and then and also and outside of that you have the adventitia. So you have mucosa, submucosa, and adventitia. The adventitia is connective tissue and C-shaped rings, or the C rings of hyaline cartilage, shown here in the diagram in blue. If you cut through across from front to back, do a cross section through the neck of a person, then you see 2 circular cavities, one smaller than the other and one larger, and one will always have the cartilage, and hyaline cartilage is quite distinctive in its histology, microscopic characteristics, so it's easy to tell. Often the smaller ring is the upper here. Smaller ring is collapsed and has a lot of muscle tissue around it. That's the esophagus. And the larger one that remains open and has hyaline cartilage, that's going to be the trachea right there. And that's what you see in this diagram here. And that's a typical cross section through the neck below the larynx. The trachea descends down and then splits into 2, and you get the right and left bronchi. These are primary bronchi. Every split into 2 is, further descending that branching system. So you go from trachea to primary bronchi, then they split into 2 to secondary bronchi. There's multiple splits as you go along. Air that goes down the bronchi gets warmed, further warming, further humidification, further cleaning of impurities, so that the air, when it eventually reaches the lung, is quite clean. Again, another subdivision into the secondary bronchi, which each supply lobes of the lungs. Overall, you have 23 branchings. So with 23 pairs of doublings, you have a huge number of branching in the lungs, and they end up, when they get as small as less than 1 millimeter in diameter, then they're no longer called bronchi, they're called bronchioles. And the very last ones are called terminal bronchioles, at least the last in terms of the conducting zone. We're still in the conducting zone so far. Okay? Conducting zone, remember, goes all the way up to the nose, from the nose down till the terminal bronchioles. And here you see a diagram showing the trachea and showing the primary bronchi and secondary and tertiary, etc. You have 2 lobes. Remember, it's the secondary bronchi that supply the different lobes, but you have 2 lobes on the left side. This is the left side. Remember, we're not interested. We're looking at the person. We're looking at the anterior view of their lungs. And so this is the left side, and here is the right side. It's their left and their right that we're interested in, not yours. Okay, so That's the left side, that's the right side. The left side has 2 major lobes, and the right side has 3. And there's a bit of a curved out empty space here, and that's where the heart is located. That space provides some space for the heart. Okay, that's why your heart's more over on the left, and the lung structure on the left is 2 lobes. So, you know, as you travel further down that bronchial pathway of the conducting zone, the bronchi or bronchioles get progressively smaller, and you have structural changes in the walls. The cartilage changes. There's less and less cartilage as you move further down. The epithelium changes, and smooth muscle, the amount of smooth muscle around the tube structures increases. In the end, when you look at it, it's a very fine meshed structure, delivering air throughout the lung tissue. And you can see that from this model here. What they've done here is they've injected a different colored latex into the bronchi and bronchioles. So the different segments, there's a number of segments. Lobes are further divided into segments. I wouldn't worry about how many segments on which side or the other, but there are multiple segments here, and each segment received a different colored latex, differently colored latex. So the latex goes in as a fluid, and when it cools, it solidifies, and then all of the rest of the lung tissue gets eaten away using an enzymatic digest. So you're just left with this multicolored latex meshwork cast, essentially, of the conducting zone. The bronchioles do have a layer of circular smooth muscle around them, which helps to mediate constriction or dilation of the bronchioles. They don't have cartilage. Remember, bronchioles are, the conducting zone tubes are called bronchioles when they have a diameter of less than 1 millimeter. So you lose the cartilage as you go further in and get to the bronchial stage, and they also do not have mucus producing cells. So this is a lack of cartilage, lack of mucus producing cells. The cartilage is not necessary, and the mucus would only act to, at this point, would only act to block the airway because it's so narrow. Now, once you get past the conducting zone, you get into the respiratory zone, and the respiratory zone is defined by the presence of alveoli. It's at the alveoli that you get gas exchange. So anywhere where you have gas exchange, that's not the conducting zone, you're into the respiratory zone. The last conducting zone tubes are the terminal bronchioles, and they feed into respiratory bronchioles. The reason they're distinct from the terminal bronchioles is that respiratory bronchioles have alveolar ducts and alveoli around them. Or rather, respiratory bronchioles have alveoli on them, and they lead also towards alveolar ducts, which lead to the rest of the alveolar sacs. It's more clear in the diagram on the next slide, or the next couple of slides. Overall, your lungs are filled with these alveoli, these grape-like structures that are hollow inside, where the air goes in and you get gas exchange between the space inside the round structure and diffusing across to the blood and from the blood. You have approximately 300 million. And that's what forms most of the lung's volume, in fact, not the bronchi and the bronchioles, but the alveoli, and they provide a really gigantic surface area for gas exchange. The bigger the surface area, the better the exchange. So here you see a diagram that clearly illustrates the idea of, conducting, the end of the conducting zone are terminal bronchioles, all of this is terminal bronchioles. There are no alveoli, and the respiratory bronchioles actually have alveoli hanging off of them. And so we're into the respiratory zone at this point. Here now, all of this, where you have alveoli, it's all respiratory zone. And the respiratory bronchioles also lead to alveolar ducts, which have even more alveoli all around them. When you look at a alveolar duct, you see its structure, that it's got lots of alveoli around it, these grape-like round structures that are hollow and contain the air, and they're connected with pores, one to the next. When you do a slice through lung tissue, you have to remember that it's a three-dimensional tissue, so you're looking at it in different orientations. When you see lots of these pockets, that's typically going to be alveolar lung tissue. And these passageways are shown here. This is a longitudinal cut of a actual Y junction here, but this is a cross-sectional cut through, through a cross-section of a alveolar, could even be a terminal bronchiole, but it's probably a respiratory bronchiole. So it's coming towards you, coming out of the plane of, going into and out of the plane of the tissue slice, and then it turns and branches into a Y structure there. So the respiratory bronchioles are in longitudinal section, cross section, and above that, that circular structure is here, is a cross section, longitudinal sections versus cross section. Okay. Well, we finally get to the alveolus, and that's where you have gas exchange occurring. This is where you have the air-blood interface. The barrier between the two is made up of the cells that form the wall of the alveolus. It's a single layer of cells. And the cells that form the wall of the capillaries around those alveoli. You have capillaries on the outer surface, the tissue side surface of the alveoli. And so you have those cells. The alveolar wall cells are flat epithelial cells, single layer, and the capillary cells are, of course, the endothelial cells that form a paving for the capillary, and they have their basement membranes or basal lamina facing each other, and they're fused together. So you have essentially a cell basement membrane or basal lamina of connective type of extruded connective tissue, and then the endothelial cell. The actual walls of the alveolus is made up of mostly type 1 epithelial cells, a single layer that permits gas exchange by diffusion, and also is secreting a molecule that is something you may have heard about. It's called angiotensin converting enzyme, and I'll talk about that more when we do renal physiology. It's quite an important enzyme molecule. There are also type 2 cells in the wall, and they secrete surfactant. Surfactant is a detergent-like molecule that reduces the surface tension of the fluid that is on the inner wall of the alveolus. In this way, when you breathe out, your alveoli don't collapse because of attraction of the water molecules to each other. This disrupts the attraction of the water molecules. And that's what detergent does, actually. So I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Here you see a small area of alveoli, and what's nice about this diagram is it shows clearly the alveoli clustered. It's clustered around alveolar ducts. The outer portion that we're looking at, which is in the tissues of the body, The outer surface of the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries where you get gas exchange, but there are also lots of elastic fibers that give this tissue a sort of a stretchy nature. And there's also bands of smooth muscle that allow for some dilation and constriction, depending on whether they're relaxed or contracting. There are lots of pores in between, connecting adjacent alveoli, so the pressure is equal throughout the lungs if everything's normal. And inside the alveolar space, you have macrophages that are there to help keep the surface sterile, killing any bacteria that may have gotten in there or happen to be able to divide, so that you don't get infections. And you see the inner area here in this diagram, showing, in this drawing what we see the wall of the alveolar space with the type 1 epithelial cells shown in pink, and they act as a paving for the entire surface, and you see the pores joining adjacent alveoli. You also see in green that there are some surfactants secreting cells, the type 2 epithelial cells or type 2 cells. And you also see that right inside the space, really actually external to the body, and it's outside of these are actually cells that are in that open space of the alveolus that's continuous with the outside world. You have macrophages. They can easily live there, and they're there to phagocytose and kill any bacteria, or just phagocytose any dust particle that happens to work its way down to the level of the alveoli. If you look at an area here in magnified, what you see is the wall of the alveolus, and you see the type 1 epithelial cell. This is the nucleus of it, and then the cytoplasm stretches out. I'll do it in a different, you see that's the cytoplasm of that type 1 epithelial cell surrounding the nucleus here. It's like that. So you have these cells forming the wall, and then you have in between, below that, you have the basal lamina, which is shown here in this area right here. That's the basal lamina, all of that. And then you have the cells that form the wall of the capillary surrounding the alveolus, where gas exchange is occurring from the blood to the alveolar space, and their capillaries of course are lined with endothelial cells. Okay, I think we can stop there. This is the end of Unit 6, Lecture 6A, part 1.